A government shutdown doesn't just slow down federal offices, it bends reality, not in a dramatic conspiracy way, but in a quiet, technical, and extremely dangerous way. Because when the government shuts down, the economy doesn't stop. People still spend, companies still hire or fire, prices still move, markets still react. But the instruments we use to measure all of that start failing. And when measurement fails, decision making breaks next. That's the hidden cost most people miss. The shutdown isn't only a budget fight, it's a data blackout. And in a data driven economy, a blackout is never harmless. The US runs on signals, the jobs report, inflation prints, GDP estimates, consumer spending, business investment, manufacturing surveys. Every week, those releases shape billions of dollars in decisions. Households decide whether to buy a car. Companies decide whether to expand payroll. Investors decide whether risk is worth taking. And policymakers, especially the Federal Reserve, decide whether to tighten or ease financial conditions. So when a shutdown disrupts those signals, it doesn't just create inconvenience. It forces the entire system to operate with a fogged windshield. Here's the logic. Data is not just information, it's coordination. It's how millions of independent actors align expectations about what is happening right now. When you remove that coordination, the economy becomes more guesswork driven, and guesswork doesn't distribute evenly. Big institutions can buy alternative data, build private models, and hedge uncertainty. Small businesses and households can't. So the distortion doesn't just affect the market, it hits the real economy through uncertainty, hesitation, and mispricing. Start with what actually happens during a shutdown. Many federal agencies pause non-essential operations. That can include parts of the statistical workforce responsible for collecting, processing, and publishing critical economic indicators. Some surveys get delayed, some are suspended, some are collected but not processed, some releases get pushed back, then dumped later in a compressed timeline. And even when an agency tries to keep a minimal flow, staffing gaps, vendor disruptions, and administrative backlog reduce quality and timeliness. Now look at how fragile economic measurement really is. Most major indicators depend on consistent sampling, consistent response rates, and consistent processing schedules. Skip a week or two, and you don't just lose a number, you can break comparability. Response behavior changes when government operations are uncertain. Seasonal adjustments become harder, revisions become larger, and the longer the interruption lasts, the more the measurement error compounds. That's how distortion begins. Not because the government lies, but because the machine that converts reality into usable statistics loses continuity. In normal times, that continuity is invisible. During shutdowns, you suddenly see how much the economy depends on it. The next step is policy. In theory, policymakers can wait. In reality, they can't. The Federal Reserve doesn't pause because a data release is delayed. Treasury doesn't pause because a survey wasn't processed. Markets don't pause because a GDP estimate is missing. Decisions still happen on schedule, and uncertainty gets priced in immediately. The Federal Reserve is a data-dependent institution. That phrase sounds reassuring until you ask what happens when the data goes missing or arrives late. When policymakers don't have clean, timely signals, they shift to proxies. They rely more heavily on financial conditions, market-based inflation expectations, regional surveys, private payroll estimates, real-time spending trackers, and anecdotal reports. Those tools can help, but they are not neutral replacements. They have biases. They can overreact, they can underreact, and they can diverge sharply from official measures that arrive later. That's where shutdowns create policy risk, because policy isn't just about knowing where the economy is, it's about knowing how confident you should be that you know. A shutdown doesn't only increase uncertainty, it hides the uncertainty inside the decision-making process, making confidence levels harder to calibrate. That increases the chance of either doing too much or doing too little. Let's break down the core distortions shutdowns create, starting with the labor market. Jobs data is one of the most powerful signals in the US. It influences interest rate expectations, consumer confidence, and business planning. If a shutdown delays employment releases, the market doesn't simply wait politely. It fills the gap with alternative narratives. Traders lean harder on private payroll numbers. Commentators overinterpret weekly jobless claims. Companies make assumptions based on local conditions and recent headlines. Meanwhile, the real labor market is still moving, but the shared view of it fractures. The same happens with inflation data. Inflation is not just a statistic, it's a psychological anchor. If inflation prints are delayed or their reliability is questioned, the uncertainty spreads into wage negotiations, pricing decisions, and consumer behavior. Firms that don't know whether cost pressures are easing or accelerating price more defensively. Workers push harder for raises if they fear inflation is higher than reported. Lenders demand more compensation if they suspect inflation risk is being undercounted. The economy becomes less coordinated and more reactive. Now move to GDP. GDP is already backward-looking by the time it's released, but it is still a crucial narrative tool. It influences political messaging, corporate strategy, and market sentiment. Shutdown delays can disrupt the cadence of GDP reporting and related releases that feed into those estimates. The result is not just late numbers, it's late clarity. And late clarity forces institutions to plan with wider error bands. When planning error bands widen, investment slows. Then there's consumer spending and retail data. In the US, consumption is the engine. When spending data is delayed or incomplete, forecasts become unstable. Companies become cautious with inventory, logistics providers reduce risk, retailers hesitate on hiring, analysts revise expectations more aggressively. These shifts don't show up as a single dramatic crash. They show up as a slow tightening of decision-making across the economy, like a room that quietly loses oxygen. And here's the part that feels counterintuitive. Even if all the delayed data eventually gets released, the damage isn't automatically undone. Because timing matters, a business decision made under uncertainty is not reversed just because the data arrives later. A hiring freeze doesn't instantly become a hiring spree. A delayed investment doesn't immediately appear as catch-up spending. Some of that activity is permanently lost, and some of it shifts in ways that make the economy less efficient. Shutdowns also distort policy decisions through what you could call narrative whiplash. When data releases are delayed, markets run on fragments. Then when the backlog clears, multiple major indicators can hit at once. That can trigger sudden repricing. Rate expectations swing. Risk assets jump or drop. Volatility increases. This isn't because the economy changed overnight, it's because the information schedule did. The system reacts not only to reality, but to the timing of reality becoming visible. This matters because policy itself influences the economy through expectations. When markets swing, financial conditions swing, credit spreads move, mortgage rates shift, equity prices affect household wealth perceptions. The shutdown-induced information shock becomes a real economic shock through the financial channel. So the shutdown doesn't just distort measurement, it can transmit that distortion into the economy as actual tightening or loosening. Now add another layer. When official data is delayed or questioned, the power balance shifts toward private data providers. Large banks, hedge funds, and major corporations pay for real-time credit card spending, shipping metrics, online pricing trackers, and payroll processors. That information advantage changes behavior. Institutions with better data can act earlier, hedge faster, and profit from uncertainty. Meanwhile, smaller players are forced to react later. That increases inequality of outcomes, not necessarily because the economy is worse, but because information access is uneven. This is why shutdowns tend to increase perceived unfairness in markets, not because everyone is corrupt, but because the information environment becomes less public and more privatized. And once that happens, trust declines. Trust matters because the economy is partly a confidence game. If people believe the system is unpredictable, they become defensive. Defensive behavior slows growth. To understand why shutdowns can lead to policy mistakes, focus on how decisions are actually made. Policymakers don't respond to raw data in isolation, they respond to trends, revisions, and confidence intervals. When a shutdown disrupts collection, it also disrupts revision cycles. Later revisions can reveal that earlier assumptions were wrong. That doesn't mean the initial decision was foolish, it means the information environment was unstable. But in macroeconomics, unstable information is enough to produce real consequences. Imagine a scenario where growth is slowing, but the slowdown is not clearly visible because some indicators are delayed. The central bank might keep policy tighter for longer than it otherwise would, fearing inflation persistence. Or imagine the opposite, where inflation is easing faster than expected, but the confirmation arrives late. Policymakers might hesitate to ease, maintaining restrictive conditions longer than necessary. Either way, the risk isn't a single catastrophic error. It's small cumulative miscalibration that compounds over quarters. Shutdowns also create distortions through administrative backlogs that spill into the private economy. Permitting delays, regulatory review delays, contract processing slowdowns, and procurement disruptions can freeze activity in sectors that depend on federal throughput. Defense contractors, infrastructure vendors, research institutions, and public-private partnerships can all face uncertainty. These are not always captured cleanly in standard macro data, but they affect employment, investment, and local growth. And because these disruptions are uneven, they create confusing signals. Some regions look strong while others quietly weaken, making national interpretation harder. Then there's the consumer psychology effect. A shutdown is not just a technical interruption, it is a visible sign of political dysfunction. That matters because economic expectations depend on governance credibility. When people see the government unable to fund itself, they don't just worry about the current disruption. They worry about future disruptions. That shifts behavior today. Households save more. Businesses delay expansion. Investors demand a higher risk premium. These are classic uncertainty responses, and they can persist long after the shutdown ends. This is why shutdowns can have long tails. The office doors reopening doesn't restore the lost confidence instantly. The economy is not a switch, it's a network. And networks don't recover by flipping a single node back on. They recover through gradual rebuilding of coordination. Now let's talk about what the historical record generally shows without turning this into a trivia contest. Past shutdown episodes have repeatedly been associated with delayed data releases, temporary disruptions in federal operations, and measurable hits to growth in the quarters they occur. But the more important lesson is not the exact number of delayed reports or the exact estimated GDP impact. The deeper lesson is that the US economy is increasingly managed through expectations, financial conditions, and fast-moving narratives. That makes it more sensitive to information gaps than it used to be. In a world where markets can move trillions of dollars in a day, the absence of trusted public data becomes a shock amplifier. When everyone sees the same dashboard, disagreements are manageable. When the dashboard goes dark, disagreements become volatility. Volatility becomes tighter financial conditions. Tighter financial conditions become slower hiring and investment, and that's how a shutdown, which looks like a political problem, becomes an economic one. There's also an institutional lesson hidden in all of this. The credibility of US economic data is a public asset. It is one of the reasons global capital flows into US markets. When shutdowns disrupt statistical continuity, they don't just delay a report. They chip away at the perception that the US system is predictable and professionally managed. That matters at the margin, and economic outcomes are often determined at the margin. So what's the conclusion? Shutdowns distort economic data by breaking continuity, delaying signals, and widening uncertainty. That distortion then spills into policy because policymakers must act on incomplete information, markets must price risk without trusted anchors, and businesses must plan with foggy visibility. The real cost is not only what the shutdown pauses, it's what the shutdown changes expectations, confidence, and coordination. And that's why shutdowns are more than political theater. They are information shocks, they privatize data advantages, they amplify volatility, they increase the probability of policy miscalibration. And they push the economy toward defensive behavior, not because the fundamentals suddenly collapsed, but because the system lost the clarity it needs to function smoothly. In a modern economy, truth isn't just what happens, it's what can be measured, communicated, and trusted in time to guide decisions. When shutdowns disrupt that process, they don't merely delay the numbers, they distort the decisions built on those numbers. And that is how a shutdown can keep hurting the economy even after the lights turn back on.